Contrary to mainstream conceptions, Native American history does not end with the defeat of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce in 1877, or the surrender of Geronimo in 1886. It does not even end with the violent suppression of the ghost dance religion at the massacre of Wounded Knee in 1890. Its final protagonists are not named Sitting Bull, Black Elk, or Ishi. The romantic notion of Native Americans fabricated by Hollywood and further advanced by the prophets of New Age spirituality is undercut when we realize that Native American society is still very much alive and its members are among the poorest in the United States. How very typical of an imperialist nation is it that from the rearview mirror of every SUV dangles a dream catcher, and white authors grow rich writing books on a horrid amalgam of beliefs, from wild speculation on Mayan religion, nitpicked practices of various native tribes, and Buddhism, and call it Native American spirituality. And meanwhile, the natives themselves have an average life expectancy of 58. They have the highest suicide rate in the United States, and 25% of them live below the poverty level as compared to the national average of 12%. These facts do not sit well with the romantic fantasies that sustain our imperialist, capitalist, and yes, genocidal culture. Liberals and conservatives alike much prefer Native Americans to remain an exciting feature of America's past, extras in John Wayne movies, or more recently, Kevin Costner movies. And they refuse to think at all about the modern Indians and their continued exploitation. But the fantasy is sustained and the facts rarely see the light of public attention. Despite the best efforts of imperialist governments and New Age plastic Indians like Carlos Castaneda and James Arthur Ray, who exploit and pervert the religious practices of various First Nations, certain Native Americans still bravely resist European imperialism. In 1990, the Mohawk Warrior Society armed themselves and donned camouflage fatigues before facing off with the Quebec Provincial Police and the Canadian Army in order to prevent the expansion of a golf course onto the Kanesatake burial grounds. Since 2002, the Okajita Warrior Society has helped the Grassy Narrows community in Ontario maintain a blockade preventing logging trucks from entering their territory. These are only two examples among many others. The history of Native Americans did not begin with the landing of Columbus, and it did not end with the closing of the frontier. Though this fact is inconvenient for our culture, the history of indigenous resistance to imperialism in America is still being written. Some of its heroes are alive today, and some are yet to be born. In 1962, Native American inmates at the Stillwater Prison in Minnesota organized 46 Indian prisoners for the purpose of educating them on Native heritage. This is possibly the country's first Native American studies program. About 1% of the Minnesota population is American Indian, but more than a third of all prison inmates in the state are Indians. We wind up in the slammer because we are too poor to raise bail and because we cannot pay for an attorney, says Dennis Banks. When Clyde Belcourt was released, he applied his organization skills to the Red Ghetto in Minneapolis. Belcourt organized in the typical fashion of the Civil Rights Movement, but soon realized that the citizenship of Native Americans was meaningless in the United States government, In 1968, Eddie Benton Benai, Clyde Belcourt, George Mitchell, and Dennis Banks, all Ojibwe Indians, organized a group called Concerned Indian Americans, though the name was quickly changed due to its unfortunate acronym, CIA, to the American Indian Movement, or A.I.M. A.I.M was primarily an urban Indian phenomenon. Large numbers of American Indians had been dumped into the cities because of the U.S. government's policy of termination. Termination was the policy from the 1940s to the 60s, wherein the U.S. government decided that Native Americans would be better off if they assimilated into mainstream American society. In order to accomplish this, the government liquidated entire tribes by terminating all federal aid, terminating their tribal sovereignty, and removing reservation land from its protected status. Approximately 2.5 million acres of trust land was removed from protected status as a result of this policy. Much of it was then sold to non-natives. This was basically the completion of the destruction of Native American communal property, which was begun by the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act, of 1891, which divided tribally held lands into individually owned parcels and opened the surplus lands to settlement and development by non-Indians. One can see how these acts made the pilfering of the last native-held lands a very smooth process. The result for the natives now left without a home is that most of them became migrant workers or ended up in the cities, leading to the emergence of the red ghettos. In the cities, due to racism, American Indians could expect to be paid the worst wages for the worst jobs. But there was one unintended consequence of the termination policy. which is that sometimes Native Americans would become politically aware in the cities. Having been subject to genocide, relegated to small parcels of unlivable land, then kicked off that land to be dumped in a city as a poorly paid industrial worker, one can see how one might take refuge in alcoholism or turn to crime, but one can also see how some might become very angry and politically radicalized. This was the forging ground for what became the Red Power movement, the primary catalyst for the formation of A.I.M. In this industrial melting pot, A.I.M reached out across tribal lines and became something of an all-inclusive indigenous peoples organization. One of the first projects A.I.M focused on was the creation of survival schools. Basically, survival schools were designed to help Native youth adjust to white society. At first, these schools often received federal funding. But it wasn't before long that A.I.M began engaging in political action to try to improve the situations of all Native Americans. In November of 1969, A.I.M participated in the occupation of Alcatraz Island under the banner of Indians of All Nations, led by a young Mohawk named Richard Oakes. The occupation lasted for a couple of years until June 1971. Under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, it designated that all out-of-use federal land would be returned to the Native people from whom it was acquired. Of course, like most other promises in the Fort Laramie Treaty, this was never upheld. Indians of all nations decided that the best place to make their symbolic stand to draw attention to this issue was the out-of-use federal prison of Alcatraz. They issued the following statement. We, the Native Americans, reclaim the land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of all American Indians by right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, a precedent set by white man's purchase of similar island about 300 years ago. We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than was paid when Manhattan Island was sold. But we know that the land values have risen over the years. Our offer of $1.24 per acre is greater than the 47 cents per acre the white men are now paying the California Indians for their land. We will give the inhabitants of this island a portion of the land for their own, to be held in trust by the American Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs to hold in perpetuity, for as long as the sun shall rise and the rivers go down to the sea. We will further guide the inhabitants in the proper way of living. We will offer them our religion, our education, our lifeways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization and thus raise them and all their white brothers up from their savage and unhappy state. We offer this treaty in good faith and wish to be fair and honorable in all our dealings with white men. We feel that the so-called Alcatraz Island is more than suitable for our Indian reservation, as determined by the white man's own standards. By this we mean that this place resembles most Indian reservations in that, 1, it is isolated from modern facilities without adequate means of transportation. 2, it has no fresh running water. 3, it has inadequate sanitation facilities. 4, there are no oil or mineral rights. 5, there is no industry and so unemployment is very great. 6, there are no health facilities. 7, the soil is rocky and non-productive and the land does not support game. 8, there are no educational facilities. 9, population has always exceeded the land base. 10, the population has always been held as prisoners and kept dependent on others. Further, it would be fitting and symbolic that ships from all over the world entering the Golden Gate would first see Indian land and thus be reminded of the true history of this nation. This tiny nation would be a symbol of the great lands once ruled by free and noble Indians. One of the activists present at the occupation was a Santee Sioux named John Trudell, who would go on to become A.I.M.'s national chairman from 1972 to 1979. Trudell became the spokesman for the occupation and began making daily radio broadcasts from the island in January of 1970. Another A.I.M. recruit in 1970 was an Oglala Sioux named Russell Means. Born on the Pine Ridge Reservation and raised in Oakland, California, Means was serving as the head of the Cleveland Indian Center in 1970 when he went to an Indian conference and upon his return formed the Cleveland chapter of A.I.M. Means resented the loss of his cultural heritage, which he said was stolen from him by the white man. In the fall of 1970 through the spring of 1971, A.I.M. and a group of traditionalists calling themselves the Oglala Sioux tribe established a camp at Mount Rushmore in a symbolic enactment of Lakota claims to the Black Hills, which were established as Indian land in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, but were violently seized from them when white prospectors discovered gold. Means established himself as a charismatic leader with a taste for inflammatory rhetoric. The radical rhetoric of Means Dennis Banks and John Trudell, caused uneasiness with the whites and non-traditional Indians. It's not too much of a surprise that as AIM gained in publicity, the John Birch Society heard the rhetoric and saw the red headbands and quickly denounced AIM as a nest for ex-convicts and communists, a claim bolstered by the fact that AIM member Mad Bear Anderson had visited the Cuban communists in 1958, and various other members, including Russell Means, had allegedly been welcomed in North Vietnam in 1971. Both the John Birch Society and later the FBI understood the term Red Indian to mean just that.